Now, this isn't going to be a comprehensive look at fighter pay in general. I just wanted to talk about a couple of guys in particular. Tony Ferguson and Colby Covington, because I really worry that both these guys are going to get screwed by the UFC, or the UFC is currently attempting to screw them out of what they're due, which is a championship payday. So, obviously, there's only one fight to make for Khabib next, and that's the Tony Ferguson fight. And Dana White even said in the press conference after UFC 242 that if Tony doesn't take the fight, then a fight with Khabib and Conor makes sense. The subtext of that statement to me reads that we're going to lowball Tony Ferguson, and when he doesn't accept our outrageously low offer, then we're going to offer Conor McGregor the fight with Khabib because that's the fight that makes everybody the most amount of money. So there's certain situations in the sport where, obviously Khabib and Tony are rivals, but Khabib needs to have Tony's back on this one, and he can't accept a fight with Conor. The next fight has to be Tony Ferguson versus Khabib, and Tony needs to get paid like a champion. Now, I'm not saying Tony needs to get paid as much as Khabib gets paid. Khabib got $6 million just in disclosed pay for his past title defense, and he's worth every penny for sure. But Tony needs to get paid like a champion. Whatever in his contract it says that he gets for a champion, like if he is the champion, that's how much he needs to get paid. He needs to get paid because he was the interim champion, and he was erroneously stripped of his interim title by the UFC for tearing his knee while he was doing media for a UFC event when he was supposed to fight Khabib. If you don't know the whole backstory with Tony and Khabib, I could go on for days trying to explain it all. They've basically been scheduled to fight 4 different times. They're both on 12-fight win streaks in the UFC. Their paths should have crossed so many times by now, and just misfortune has struck it at every single turn. But Tony is the guy. I hate to continue to pick against Khabib, but the reason why I pick against Khabib is because he's one-dimensional. Now, in that one dimension, he is just universes better than everybody else. He is by far the greatest specialist in the history of mixed martial arts with his grappling. If you think about some of the other greatest specialists like Damian Maia or Wonderboy Thompson or somebody like that, they can't effectively apply their game in the same way as consistently as Khabib does. Khabib just applies his game and it does so every single fight in the exact same way every time. Everybody knows what's coming and nobody can stop it. A bit of a rant there. Let's get back to the fighter pay talk. Tony needs to get paid like a champion because he is a champion. He is the interim champ. He needs to get paid significantly for this fight. And where Colby Covington comes into this story is obviously Colby and Kamaru Usman were supposed to compete for the undisputed welterweight title coming up here at Madison Square Garden, but they couldn't come to an agreement on for that fight. For that card. So now obviously Masvidal and Diaz is the main event over there, which is phenomenal. I'm stoked that that's the main event because I want to see that fight for 5 rounds. I'm also really encouraged and stoked that the UFC is willing to make a title, even though it's a BMF title, a non-title fight in a pay-per-view main event. I think that they need to do this more often if they've got an exciting fight. It doesn't need to be a title fight at the top of a pay-per-view. You can have just an extremely exciting fight at the top of a pay-per-view. But the reason why Colby and Kamaru aren't competing at the top of that card is because the UFC tried to lowball Colby Covington, and it's the exact same situation as Tony Ferguson. Colby was the interim champion. He was erroneously stripped of the title, because he couldn't make a turnaround on like 2 months' notice, 3 months' notice, when he had sinus surgery to unify the welterweight titles with Woodley. Because he couldn't operate on the UFC's timeline, they just stripped him of his title. It's just ridiculous. So, the UFC is trying to, pay Colby whatever he got paid for probably his last fight or whatever his contract, typically stipulates. But Colby needs to get paid like a champion for this fight as well. Especially considering that, this fight, Colby and Kamaru Usman, is a fight where Kamaru Usman is never going to sell as many pay-per-views in his career as he's going to be able to sell when he fights Colby Covington. And that's because of Colby Covington. It's because he talks immense amounts of shit. He's very controversial. Remember when he walked into at a UFC, whatever it was, with Pettis and Diaz and Romero and Costa and Stipe DC. When Colby comes into that stadium, the entire stadium is in the middle of one of the most exciting fights of the year, Diaz versus Pettis, is chanting, "Fuck you, Colby." UFC fans want to see this guy lose. He's going to draw a ton of eyeballs, and he's the A side in this fight. He needs to get paid like a champion for that fight. So whatever Kamaru is getting paid, he should be getting paid what Kamaru is getting paid. In the case of Tony Ferguson and Khabib, Khabib is an established star. He's got an extreme following. I think Khabib deserves to get paid more than, anybody else in the sport other than Conor, maybe John Jones. So Tony doesn't need to get paid exactly what Khabib's getting paid. Like, Colby should be getting paid exactly what Kamaru is getting paid. That should be a 50-50 split fight. But Ferguson should be getting a significant pay. Like, Dustin Poirier got paid $250,000 for that fight. $250,000. That's not enough for Tony Ferguson. He needs to be $500,000, $1 million flat type of a payday. If Khabib's getting $6 million, Tony needs to be getting paid significantly. And I just worry that the UFC is going to try to lowball Tony Ferguson and then when Tony doesn't accept their lowball embarrassing offer, that they're going to use that as spin zone in their favor to say, well, Tony didn't want the fight, so we offered it to Conor. Which, that would just be a travesty of the sport. That would be an absolute travesty.